And I'll just do a very brief little introductory spiel. Welcome, everybody. This session is being led by Dr. Manuel Rausch. Just as a brief reminder, please stay muted throughout and keep your cameras off, mostly for reasons of bandwidth. Dr. Rausch will share a presentation with you, and then you will be able to ask questions directly of him via the sticky note function on Miro board, which we should all be pretty familiar with now after the last session. After the presentation, I will put the link to the Miro board in the chat, and I'll also put a link to a Miro board resource in the meantime, in case you want to just refresh your memory or sharpen your skills. And that's about it. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Rausch, and I'll be dropping those links in the chat shortly.
Awesome. Rachel, really appreciate it. Am I showing the right slides? I have two screens and I'm never sure which one I'm showing.
Yeah, I see research plan, IM, and BI.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And it's kind of weird to speak to a room of 118 people, of whom I can see nobody. But I'm just assuming that you're all really interested in what I'm having to say, and your faces reflect that, albeit secretly. It's my great privilege, and I'm really quite honored to have been given this opportunity to be part of the steering committee for this workshop, as well as to speak to you about the research plan, intellectual merit, and broader impacts. A lot of what you'll hear from me is probably things that you've heard from colleagues, as well as in the context of other workshops. But they're nonetheless important. I also want to highlight that I had the great honor of speaking this morning to our NSF counterpart, Laurel, who helped me make sure that everything I'm telling you today is actually accurately reflecting the opinions of the NSF. And when it's my own opinion, I will actually highlight that, and I'll put a little disclaimer there as well. And I'm really looking forward to also getting questions from you about the various aspects of what I'll be sharing with you. So hopefully you'll remember it or take a little note so that you can ask me afterwards. So we'll be talking about the research plan, and I think hopefully that's pretty clear to everybody at this point, but the research plan is kind of the meat of your application. If you're a vegetarian, then it's maybe the tofu of your application, but it's just the sort of like most important part, right? That kind of drives the overall proposal. And as such, of course, it covers the important questions of what are you planning to do? Why do you want to do it? How is it significant? How will you do it? And then why are you the one to do it? And when I spoke to Laurel this morning, she wanted me to highlight that the research plan is really the plan of the work that you're planning to do or intend to do. And albeit this would be sort of obvious looking at the research plan, it happens quite often that people spend a lot of time describing and talking about the work they have done in the past, rather than focusing on the work they want to do moving forward. And so that's just something to be conscious about. And I really liked that Laurel pointed this out this morning, and I added this to the presentation. It's just a quick reminder to y'all. What I also wanted to make sure of is that everybody's aware that you actually have a lot of freedom in writing NSF proposals. Many proposal formats and different funding agencies have different restrictions and maybe prescribing certain things, and so does the NSF proposal. But overall, you have a lot of freedom in that you can choose how you organize your proposal. You can choose what you emphasize and what you want the reviewer to pay particular attention to. You can choose how much background information you provide, how many figures you include, how many references you include. There's a lot of freedom you have. And with that freedom, hopefully also comes to you sort of the enjoyment of that freedom and also the developing of your own style. I'll be speaking some later on about my own style that I've developed. And I looked this up right before to make sure I reflect this accurately. I've written 10 proposals for the NSF. And in this process, you just kind of develop your own idea of how you think it should be done. You attend different review panels, and you kind of get a sense of how other people do it. I've read my colleagues, sometimes as a service to them, sometimes because I wrote one with them. And you just kind of see things that work in your mind, the things that don't work, and you kind of converge towards something that works for you. So when you read someone else's, learn from it, critically reflect on it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you do the exact same thing. Regardless of how you organize your research plan, and I'm sure you've been told this by trusted colleagues, friends, and maybe family, depending on who your family is, but when you write, you should always focus on writing clearly and concisely. And as you do so, write clearly and concisely what you're planning to do, why you want to do it, how you will do it, and why you're the one to do it. So you, in essence, want to answer those questions that the reviewer will inevitably have as they review your proposal and as they will have to make a decision onto how they rank your proposal in comparison to other proposals. I think most critically, and this is something that I still have to remind myself of, and that I think was to me the largest learning experience, is to learn to write to your audience. So obviously, everybody always tells you, know who your audience is. But I want to add to that, that it's also really critical to understand under which circumstances your audience will actually read your proposal. Because I think we often have this idea that the reviewers that we write to are, these relaxed, curious, well-slept, well-fed, and just overall happy folks that can't wait to dive into the science of other people. They sit at their beautiful mahogany tables and they have all the time in the world to write these proposals. And under those circumstances, I think some complex language, some complex ideas, maybe not in super detail described, would not be difficult to comprehend for someone as smart as the audience of your proposal, right? But the reality is that's not how most people review proposals. And although this is not how I review proposals, I at some point read a tweet by someone who said, the only space they can find in their house away from their children is in the bathroom. So that's where they review proposals. And to me, that was just a really important telling piece of information, right? Like, how are people reviewing these proposals? They may be tired, they may be exhausted. They're probably doing it at the end of the day because it's maybe not their priority. Maybe they work on their own proposal as their priority. So consider under what circumstances someone reviews a proposal and in which state, and that helps you also really understand why people emphasize the clearly and the concisely, and sometimes just the simpler of how to describe a research plan. So what is in this research plan? And I think you all know this, but there's essentially two big, broad categories by which your proposal will be evaluated: by the broader impacts and by the intellectual merit. And we abbreviated that in the title as BI and IM. I've actually learned this morning, to my embarrassment, that broader impact is the only required header. Intellectual merit does not need to be mentioned as a specific title. I have always done that, and apparently that's a historic thing. So today you don't need to specifically have a section called intellectual merit, albeit when I describe how I write my proposals, you'll notice that I still have a section that I call intellectual merit. But please note, broader impact needs to be mentioned as a section title. So let's talk a little bit about what is intellectual merit and what is broader impact. And I think I cannot be the only person who was at first confused by the concept of intellectual merit and broader impact. When I started out as an assistant professor 6 years ago, I had primarily experience with this sort of NIH writing style. And that was simply because I was in labs that primarily lived off NIH funding. And so I kind of had a sense what that looked like. And then I started writing my first NSF proposal, and I looked at the official language, and I was just kind of confused about what this intellectual merit really meant to be, what the broader impacts were, and how they were differentiated. And so I'm trying to do, hopefully, a pretty good job at describing from my perspective, as well as the NSF perspective, what those two are. So this is the official language of the NSF. The intellectual merit criterion encompasses the potential to advance knowledge. So I paraphrase that a little bit, just because I find this a little like stiff. So what I think of, what I think of intellectual merit is, this is where you want to describe how your work will benefit the small circle of experts in your and adjacent fields. So this really means that, if you're a biomechanician and you're interested in cartilage mechanics, for example, that this is where you want to describe how your knowledge will move forward the cartilage biomechanics field. I do want to mention this disclaimer that this is my personal take. So this is really important because this is kind of the narrow technical aspects of your proposal. So now, when you look at what should go into an intellectual merit and how will your intellectual merit be evaluated, these are the official criteria, okay? So these are copied one-to-one from the NSF. And you will see later on that they actually pop up exactly the same way for the broader impact as well, with a small change, which is what you see here highlighted in boldface. So what are the official criteria by which the reviewers are asked to evaluate your intellectual merit? Well, first of all, of course, by the potential of the proposed activity to advance the knowledge, as it was described as the official definition. But then there come these other 4 points in which you're asked to essentially review, as a reviewer, a proposal by what extent the proposed activity suggests explore creative, original, and potentially transformative concepts. I'm not going to read each bullet point, but you notice that each bullet point is aiming at sort of a different orthogonal aspect of your proposal. The third bullet point is about the well-reasonedness and organization of your research plan, whether you have mechanisms to assess success, whether you're qualified as a team, and whether you're in the right environment, whether you have the resources. So this covers essentially all bases of what makes a successful research project. And to me, looking at these while I write a proposal is incredibly important, reminding myself, what are the things that the NSF reviewers are asked to review my proposal by? Because when I review a proposal, I forget these points again. And the program director is always well organized enough to send us these as a reminder. And I put them in front of me, print them out, read a proposal, go back to these criteria, and I look through them and I answer each single one of them. So of course, you're extremely well served to keep these in mind while you write your proposal so that you can write a proposal that then allows the reviewer to answer these 5 questions. And writing proposals is almost like a hacking process in that you really want to understand how the review process works so that you can write a proposal that is being successfully assessed, right? You don't want just people to read and like it. You actually want them to perceive this as a successful example of a proposal. And so what I recommend you do is you take your proposal, you look at these 5 points. And first of all, you make sure you're answering them, right? Each of them needs to be answered. Not all of them need to be only answered by the research strategy, right? For example, whether you're qualified to some extent will also emerge from your biosketch. Similarly, whether you have the right resources will also emerge to some extent from your facilities and equipment file. But you want the proposal overall and the research strategy in particular to successfully answer these questions. And then I think this is a really important next step that I really only learned from others over time is that you really want to make this easy on reviewers to find, right? So if I have your proposal in front of me, and usually you review 4, 5, 6 or so at the same time, I have one of them in front of me, and now I'm writing this preliminary report, and I look at these bullet points, and now I go look, right? Because I may not remember, I just read 15 pages. I may not remember exactly how sound the rationale was or how different elements were described or whether there was a mechanism to assess the success of research objective 1. So I will go back in my PDF, right? I'll scroll back. And now if you give me a header that's called something like assess success or a success assessment or evaluation strategy, then I can just go in there and between you and me, right? I can look at your statements and say like, okay, this statement is actually great. That summarizes how you plan to assess your success, and I can include that in my report. So do yourself a favor and make it as easy as possible for reviewers to find where you describe how you actually answer those 5 bullet points. And the same will hold true for the broader impacts later on as well. So let's go to broader impacts. Broader impacts, or the broader impact criterion encompasses the potential to benefit society and contribute to the achievement of specific desired societal outcomes. This is the official NSF language. The way that I read this and how I practically interpret this when I write a grant is that this is where I want to describe how my work, if funded, will impact those outside of that small circle of experts. And again, when I was speaking to my NSF counterpart on this workshop, she was mentioning that the way she looks at it is, how will the knowledge and the findings leave the lab? And not in a bad way, right? Not in a they're running away from you way, but how will they impact the world outside? How will they impact the taxpayer who has funded that proposed work, who is basically allowing you to do the science that you set out to do? And when you describe this, and I'm going to talk in a little bit of more detail about this, but when you describe this, the official criteria are almost identical to the ones that I just showed you for the intellectual merit, except here in the first bullet point, of course, the language is altered to account for the fact that we're now looking at broader impacts. So we should be looking at the potential of the proposed activities to benefit society or advance societal outcomes, but the rest is the same. How qualified are you to actually follow through on this broader impact plan? Do you have the right resources? Do you evaluate success? And do you have the right teammates, right? So these are actually the same. And all the things I just said, they're holding true again. So you want to make sure that when you describe your broader impacts, these bullet points are answered. And again, you want to make this as easy as possible for the reviewer to maximize the chance that the reviewer will actually find how you address each of these bullet points, because you may do that, but you may do this in a weird hidden way. It may be in a figure caption or hidden in a figure, or it may be rephrased somehow in a way that it's not becoming immediately clear to the reviewer that that's what you're really describing. So make sure it's clear, and feel free to use similar wording so that finding this is going to be easy. I don't want you to read this whole text. When I ran the slide draft by an NSF colleague, they asked me to add this here. So when you get access to the slides, please take a moment to read through it. I highlighted a couple of things in this text that I want to speak to real quick. This question has also popped up in some of the pre-submitted questions. Can the broader impacts directly emerge from the research? And the answer is yes. So sometimes your broader impact basically comes or emerges sort of intrinsically from your research. In my case, I do biomechanics research, and sometimes I may be looking at some sort of fundamental mechanism of disease that, once understood and once described, may actually directly benefit a doctor and therefore their patients, right? So this is a broader impact that immediately arises from the research itself. But your activities and the goals for your broader impact can also be complementary to your research objectives, right? They don't need to be identical or perfectly aligned. There's definitely some freedom for them to be sort of a parallel development. And then finally, it's just important that you focus on the language of societally relevant outcomes. And those can be very broad. When I started out writing broader impacts, my sense was that this was all about, say, marginalized populations, right? That was sort of like the first thing that came to my mind. And so all my ideas for broader impact statements and how I could have broader impact was all surrounding marginalized populations. And while, of course, that is one critical population who we would like to positively impact, that's not the only way to have broader impact. We can have broader impact through educational outreach, broader impact within our university. We can have broader impact by reaching out to industrial partners. There's many ways to have broad impact and benefit society in a way that leaves our lab, that is not constrained to our lab. And so I'm just going to share with you how I have learned and how I now sort of routinely approach an NSF proposal. Again, this is not how you have to do it, but this is how I do it, and I find it to work fairly well for me. And I always start out with a one-pager. And I think, many grant mechanisms have this in common, and they may be called different things. For the NIH, it may be called a specific aims page. For, DoD mechanisms, they may have a separate name, maybe called white papers or other things. But the idea is that you don't want to wait 15 pages to tell somebody why they should be excited about your work, right? And so a first page overview can really help summarize what you're trying to do in one page and really give the reader a strong sense of what are you wanting to do, why is it important, how are you going to do it, and why are they the right people to do it, right? And if you can do this on one page, you should really manage to excite the reviewer. You haven't won yet, right? At the end of the first page, you probably haven't won. There's another 14 pages to evaluate. But if you don't manage to excite the reviewer and convince them that you've sort of answered positively the fundamental questions that the NSF is asking you to answer, then it's going to be unlikely that the reviewer will change their mind along the way. It happens, of course. Sometimes somebody writes a poor first page, but the rest is good, but it happens quite rarely in my experience. So make sure that you have a strong first page at the end of which you really capture the reviewer's positive attention. And so the way I do it is I usually have one paragraph in which I generally describe the topic. I follow this sort of sand clock pattern, right, where you go from broad to specific back to broad. So I start with a broad topic. I work down specifically to the knowledge gap I'm trying to fill, describe my strategies, and then go broad again, in which I explain what the expected outcomes are and how they benefit both my sort of scientific niche as well as how they broadly impact society. So that's how I start. I usually keep this to one page with very rare exceptions. Sometimes I include a figure on the first page that may take up too much space, and then I'll bleed a little bit into the second page. And then I dive into providing background information. And I think this is where I have made the most drastic changes from my first iteration of proposals to what I do now, which is I used to provide a ton of information. I really thought the background information is so I'm going to impress my colleagues, right? This is what I'm really going to show. I'm a scholar. I know all this, and you should trust me, right? I know all this. I've read all these papers, and therefore, what follows, you can trust. That's unfortunately not really how I think an attractive proposal works, in that the reviewer is maybe excited to learn about your proposed science, but often the reviewer is not there to be educated on background information that may not be critical to the actual proposal, right? And so my first bullet point here is to only include knowledge that's actually relevant to answer the questions of what, who, how, and why. This is not the time to show off unrelated knowledge. And you can here integrate some of your own previous work. But to remind you of my colleague's words earlier, you want to really focus in this proposal on what you're planning to do and not what you've done in the past, right? Your biosketch is included in, excuse me, I'm going to call. Thank you. Your biosketch is included in the package of your proposal. And therefore, people have access to all the papers you've written and all the areas you're an expert on. This is not the space to do this. And at the end, I just want to make sure that I've provided the knowledge that's critical for someone to then successfully digest and hopefully appreciate the rest of my proposal. And then finally, you have to strike a balance here between an expert reader and a non-expert reader, in that you may be lucky or unlucky to have a reviewer who knows your topic extremely well. And so you definitely want to make sure that you accurately reflect the prior work that has led you to this, in that you don't want to seem like, you don't acknowledge the prior work and maybe their work. There's a decent chance, right, that they may look for their own name in citations here. But you also don't want to lose the non-expert reader, right? You want to keep this general enough that the non-expert reader can read it. Next, I always write an intellectual merit paragraph. And although intellectual merit as a header is not required anymore, I think this is a nice space to just kind of summarize in a couple bullet points my most important intellectual contributions. It's usually half a page, 2, 3, 4 bullet points, where I just really think about what will people learn and take away from this, and how am I contributing to the expert knowledge in this field? And most often these bullet points pretty much align with the expected outcomes of my research objectives. Not everybody does this. So if you've seen other people that basically call their research strategy an intellectual merit paragraph. So there's all kinds of ways to do this. And as we learned, you don't even have to have intellectual merit as a term there. But I want to come back to this idea that when somebody is supposed to evaluate your intellectual merit, it can be really helpful to have a section that's entitled intellectual merit, and they can just go there and look at what is the intellectual merit of this? How does the writer characterize their work? And can I actually steal some of those ideas as I write my evaluation of this proposal? Next, I describe my research strategy. I take usually about 6 pages, and this really varies depending on how much space I take elsewhere, but this is your traditional strategy section, right? I organize it usually by research objectives. I have 2, 3 research objectives, and under each objective, I usually explain my rationale and motivation, methods, including statistics. I wrote statics, which in a statics proposal might make sense, but I mean statistics, alternative strategies, validation strategies, expected outcomes. I think these are sort of generally how folks describe, at least in my area, regardless of funding mechanism, their research strategy. And then please note that this may be program dependent, whether there's certain things that are traditionally included in your program or not. That is something that you can learn from the program director and or from colleagues who share their successful research proposals. And then finally, I get to describe the broader impacts. I personally usually divide them into subsections according to the type of impact that I believe they have, because there are many ways to have impact. We talked about this a little bit earlier. You can have impact through your research, through educational efforts, through outreach with industry partners, outreach with other educational units, etc. I usually have something like a header called societal impact or medical impact, open science or educational impact. So I don't always describe all of them. I try to be realistic about what can be accomplished with the time and the funds that I have available. And I just want to urge you to keep in mind the broader impacts can come from research as well as educational objectives. And then I personally love this section. I love being creative. I love thinking about ways that my work can be framed in a way that may be interesting to my neighbor, that may be interesting to a kindergartner or a high school student, and then think about activities that or through which I could accomplish that. When I evaluate broader impacts as a reviewer, one of the first questions I always ask myself, are they taking this section seriously? Because sometimes you really get the sense that folks only do this sort of like to check a checkbox. And overall, you just don't get the sense that this is being taken seriously, that they're really trying to think about ways that their work has or can have broader impacts. And often I ask myself, are they creative but realistic, right? Just like with your research strategy, creativity and innovation are evaluation criteria as per the bullet points that I listed earlier, and they're being evaluated in your broader impacts as well. Often I get the sense that a lot of time and energy is spent on strategies for intellectual merit because we kind of think that's what we really do, right? That's our job. This is where I'm going to put a lot of effort into. And then the broader impacts are kind of broadly described and no specifics. It doesn't seem to be a plan. And keep in mind that there's two criteria by which your proposal will be evaluated: intellectual merit and broader impact. So this is one of two criteria. You want to take this seriously. It always helps when PIs have done things previously that kind of show they actually do stuff. Do they have experience? Do they know what you're talking about? I like to see that strategies are integrated into existing infrastructure, because you don't need to reinvent the same wheel over and over again. If you have an infrastructure at your university, why not use it? Why not contribute to an existing effort, as long as you sort of can distinguish that from what has been done prior? Are these efforts scalable? This is something that's often ignored, right? If I say, my strategy is to go to a high school class once, and I speak about, biomechanics in my case, then albeit those students may be greatly impacted, none of the next students are impacted by it, right? So you want to think about, how could I scale this? Could I work with a teacher, teach them how to talk about biomechanics, say in a kindergarten framework, and then have them integrate that into curriculum. And all of a sudden they can do this every year. So that would be, in my mind, a scalable effort rather than unscalable. Or you can even think farther. How can I prepare materials that any teacher across, the US or at least within state lines could access and then use? And that scalability, I would evaluate as a positive thing. And then are there resources actually available to do what you're proposing to do? Are you budgeting money if this is a costly endeavor? If not, where else are you going to get the money for? And then finally, is there an evaluation plan? Is there any means by which you will judge at the end of the activity whether you've done this activity successfully or not? This is important because that helps me feel confident that what you're planning to do is actually going to get done. So for takeaways, I just want to wrap this up and say, solicit successful proposals and learn from them. This is just such a critical element of doing anything, right? To not have to reinvent the wheel, but have prior examples guide you in your own development as you develop your own style. Make sure that when you do develop a style, that it complies with the NSF requirements. Write a proposal that is easy to read, easy to understand, and excites. I mean, that's ultimately what a reviewer is looking for. If I have a good time reading your proposal, it's going to be hard to convince me to not want to fund this, right? Like, I'm having fun. I'm liking the ideas. I'm liking the way that you're walking me through this. That's going to make me feel positive about your proposal and likely positive about recommending it for funding. Well, ranking it high. Keep in mind, and I think this is such a critical thing to learn, that you don't write for yourself, but you write for others. And albeit it can be really nice to fall in love with your own writing, it can really hinder you from communicating what you're trying to communicate with others. So what I really try to practice is really try to internalize this idea. Let's read this from the perspective of somebody who's not an expert in this. Maybe from the perspective of someone who doesn't like me very much and is looking for critical things, so things that I'm not doing well. And that can be kind of a frustrating process, right? To have to go back and revise and reword paragraphs maybe that you really like. But I think it's a critical element of writing well. And then to make sure to differentiate between your broader impacts and intellectual merit, identify the research gaps that excite your peers. I mean, ultimately, that's what it's all about, right? You want to excite folks. And you have to do this at least through the intellectual merit or the broader impact, or ideally both. and then devise a creative but realistic broader impact strategy, and finally enjoy the process. For most of us, this is our career, right? This is what we're going to be doing for the next 30 to 40 years. And we're going to be writing proposals. And for me, it really helped after a couple of years to develop sort of a change in mindset from, oh, I have to do this so I can do the science, to, oh, I get to do this. I get to actually dream up experiments, dream up plans that may never take fruition, right? I may never get the proposal funded, but at least in the moment, I get to be wild and I get to be envisioning all these kind of cool experiments that I otherwise couldn't do. And to me, that has really helped just making this whole process much more enjoyable. So these are my prepared slides. I think I'm going to stop sharing at this point, and then I think we're going to swap over to the Miro board, where y'all can ask questions, and I'm really relying on my ASEE counterpart here to help me out with this process.
No
Thank you
problem.
for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Rausch. So I've dropped the link to Dr. Rausch's Miro board in the chat towards the end of his presentation, so it's recent. If you have a moment, Dr. Rausch, there were some pre-submitted questions, which you could go ahead and just scan really quickly.
I'll have them in front of me.
Yeah, as people are drafting their Miro board questions. Otherwise, you know, it's your show, so you take questions as you see fit. And I will go ahead and mark questions that are answered with a thumbs up, and I'll move them to the left-hand column under questions answered.
Appreciate it. Yeah. So the first question was, does NSF allow partnerships with private K-12s in addition to partnerships with underprivileged schools? I'm really happy for Laura to correct me here, but I don't think the NSF restricts who you're working with. I think that's part of your creative freedom, who you work with, as long as you convince others that what you're doing benefits society. The second question was, should the broader impacts only include teaching? And I think I answered this to some degree. Your broader impacts can be broad and wide. You can have educational broader impacts. The impact can come from your research itself. You can work with industry partners. No, it's not limited to only teaching. Since career PIs are still in early stages of their profession, what are the kinds of credentials that can be used to determine whether or not a PI is qualified to do the work proposed? In general, the best thing is always to have prior examples for work. And that is true for the intellectual merit as well as broader impacts. But when you start out, you may just not have this. And so please be aware that previous work that your ideas may be based on don't need to be your own. You can cite other people's work as prior work and establish that others have maybe, you know, collected data that supports your central hypothesis or that tests the viability of your research plan. So ideally, you've done work that highlights your ability to do things, mention it, as long as it's critical to what you're doing. But you can also use other people's work to support your strategies. And then the final submitted question is, I intend my broader impact work to grow in close coordination with my research. How normal is it to have these two sections interrelated? So as I said, the broader impact can stem directly from your research. I think it's just important that in your broader impact section, you actually exactly explain how that happens, right? Don't just expect for folks to kind of understand that, you know, your scientific finding may have broad societal implications. I think you want to really highlight that and discuss that in your broader impact section.
Hey, Manuel, can I add a few things?
Please.
Awesome. All right. Thanks. Hi, everyone. For those who I haven't met yet, I'm Laurel Cookhouse, one of the program directors from NSF. I just want to add a couple of things to these great questions that were submitted in advance. So the first question about, can we have partnerships with private K-12 schools? You can have a partnership with just about any organization you want, within certain caveats, and your sponsored research office will probably tell you if you're you know, if you're in danger of working in that space. You know, for example, with very few exceptions, all NSF money must go to support US organizations. So there's no restrictions on other kinds of partnerships. It doesn't have to be only underprivileged schools. And to that most recent question about expecting broader impact and research work to grow together, I think that is exactly what makes career proposals is the integration of research and education. And I know one of the other speakers will be talking to everyone about that. And maybe we've stalled enough times that they're, oh, good. It looks like there's lots of questions growing in the Miro board.
There sure are. Thank you, Laura. Really appreciate it. The first question I'm going to answer is, do we need to have a dedicated evaluator and have budget assigned to it? And so I, in fact, in my career proposal, had an evaluation service here from the university write me an evaluation plan, and I included that, and I actually budgeted for it as well. I don't think there is a have to, right? I think it's all dependent on whether it makes sense to or not. I think having someone who's a professional evaluator and being able to budget for that is a solid strategy, right? And it's, I think, reaffirming to the sort of like soundness of your strategy, but your budget may not allow for it. But then you have to have a realistic strategy for who would do that. And a letter of support, for example, from someone who would be willing to do this for free or would be a helpful sort of resource to kind of establish that you can actually get this evaluation plan.
Can I just add to that,
please.
that if you're going to have an external evaluator, yes, you should include them in the budget or explain why you're not, because reviewers tend to believe that the work will get done if you're going to pay the people for the work.
The next question that I randomly picked here was, what are the best ways to tie the evaluation metrics to intellectual merit, broader impact, and educational efforts? I'm not sure I understand the question as to what it means to tie the evaluation metrics. I think each section should have its own appropriate evaluation metrics, right? Your research and the success of your research may be evaluated differently than, say, the success of your broader impacts, right? And so for broader impacts, you may do an activity with students. You may want to have a pre and a post survey to actually quantify in some way that they learned something. And it turns out it's not very easy to do that. There's some guides, but it takes some thinking and some exposure to how do you do that well to kind of do that. And you want to describe that in your proposal. There's another question. Hi, does the NSF have a position on projects with potential for commercialization and patenting, etc.? I'm going to let Laurel answer this because I actually don't know this.
Yeah, I'm a little confused by the phrasing of what does it mean to have a position on that? You know, we support a lot of work that ultimately leads to, you know, patentable products, especially out of our TIP directorates. You know, I would say within the context of the career proposal, because that's what we're all here to talk about, you know, if there is some commercialization potential that you see, you should remember to say that in the proposal. And if there is not, I don't think it's necessarily a negative. And if there was some nuance in that question that we missed, I hope you'll give us a more refined version of it.
The next question that I picked up here is, the biography might not have the work related to the career proposal as it is a new area to set apart from previous advisors. Would that impact the career proposal evaluation? I read that question as, do you need preliminary data or prior publications? So if you have work on it, you should definitely include it in your biography. And if it's relevant to your proposal, you should definitely highlight that in your proposal where you describe that you are the person qualified for this. If you have just preliminary data that's unpublished, you can also include that in your proposal. You know, be a little conscious about it, right? If that is something that you think someone could steal from you, albeit, of course, that would be illegal by the NSF, you just want to be aware that this data is unpublished and you want to highlight that somewhere. And so in that sense, yes, if you collected new things that set you apart from your prior work and that supports your strategy, you should definitely include that in your proposal. And that would probably not find space in a publication because you don't have one. Please note, you can describe your expertise in your bio sketch and don't necessarily need to back that up with a publication, right? You can say that I have studied organism XYZ. That is absolutely okay in your biography.
Where does that go in the bio sketch manual?
Oh, I have to be careful. Maybe I'm thinking about the NIH style right
now. Yes. Remember which agency's bio sketch, because ours is, you know, your 5 products, your five products closely related, 5 other products that you're proud of.
It could be in the 5
considered-
products though, right? So you could, for example, have collected some data and made that openly available. It could be sort of a data repository.
Yes,
So yeah, I hope
but
I
it's not a narrative, though. You could certainly put that in your proposal.
That's a
You
good
know,
point.
if you wanted to, you know, and I'll kind of supplement to this answer of, you know, what if I haven't published in what I'm proposing to do? Well, I mean, Manuel, what do you think as a reviewer? What do you look for in those situations? You know, do you look for maybe preliminary data, maybe some extra reassurance, or, you know, well-developed alternative strategies section? You know, if you're expecting the reviewers to wonder about something, own it, head it off at the pass, and tell them why they shouldn't be worried and why you're qualified to do this work, even though you might not have published in it yet.
Yeah, I mean, Laurel, actually, one of the very first conversations that you and I had like 4 years ago, I asked you that specific question, and you reminded me that previous work doesn't need to be your own previous work. If you want to establish that something, for example, can be done technically, you can cite someone else. And of course, it's a little less strong than if you've done it yourself, because you still require people to trust that you are as capable as the person you're citing. But I think in the end, it's all a balance, right? And that you are a career proposal writer, and that implies that you're at the earlier stages, and people know that. There's an expectation that you don't have the kind of credentials that somebody after 10, 20 years of doing this work would have. And so I think reviewers are willing to take a leap of faith if you otherwise convince them that you're a competent scientist. And I think that comes out of your strategy and your writing and your ability to frame the problem. There's a question that says, knowing that there are 2 sides of the story, what we think we write in the proposal and what others understand from our narrative about it, how do you balance between being innovative and creative while also communicating something that is perceived as realistic by the reviewers, both the expert and the non-expert? How do you strike a balance? I think fundamentally, that's going to be a product of experience, right? I think every time you write a proposal and every time you get feedback for a proposal, you kind of learn how people look at what you write. I think this is just something where, you know, some people are more conservative, others are a little more adventurous. You just have to kind of look at what you're proposing and look at a reasonable reviewer, the idea of a reasonable reviewer, and consider how will they look at this. There's no reassurance that somebody is not going to be overly critical, right? Some people will be overly critical. But the good news is that, first of all, there's multiple reviewers. And having been in an NSF panel was really enlightening in that I felt a lot better about the process after I've been part of it than what I had anticipated. When people are unreasonable, there's often, if not always, a reasonable counterpart that helps you out. I've rarely seen somebody acting unreasonable where somebody wasn't gently or abruptly sort of like defending maybe the writer there. You also have the program directors that make sure that everything is being done fairly, right? That if there were any biases expressed, etc., that would be reined in. So overall, I would write this expecting to get a reasonable reviewer and putting yourself in the position. If you were reading this, what would you expect? Would you trust me based on what I'm presenting to be able to do that? Would you trust the central hypothesis to actually shake out the way that you expect it to? And I think you can expect a reasonable reviewer on the other end, or at least on average, a reasonable reviewer. And I've been in enough panels that so far has always held truth. And I encourage you to do the same. It's been a very positive experience for me. I'm pulling up another one here. A question on grantsmanship. What is the best practice for figures that describe the background? Do you only include your own data figures? Is it a shape figures from other papers? Yes, absolutely. You can use other figures. And there is definitely sort of a balance, right? You have limited space. It's a zero-sum game. But believe me one thing, there's rarely a proposal that doesn't get funded because people didn't write enough. That is almost never the case, right? You can definitely don't pack your proposal to the absolute maximum. There's nothing more scary for a reviewer than to look at 15 pages of just ink. So use your space wisely, and that doesn't mean maximize your words, right? Use a figure to break things up. Use a figure to illustrate things and maybe illustrate it better. And sometimes to just break up the monotony of writing. Use spaces. Make it easy for people to relax every once in a while as they're working through your proposal. And yes, you can absolutely use other figures And yes, you should definitely credit those originators of the figure and cite them.
Awesome. I'm going to add to that. If you do use a figure that's not yours, please do cite it. Make it clear that it's not yours. Otherwise, using it without citing is called plagiarism. And if that happens in your proposal, it will make us sad. It will make you sad. And I'm also going to say, Manuel, thank you for giving me the chance to say, like I do in almost every meeting, I prefer the word grantspersonship instead of grantsmanship. Sounds clunky the first time it rolls off your tongue, but after that, it feels like, yeah, this should be a word.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Laurel. I'm going to the next question. In your experience on panels, have panelists question viability? Sorry, there's like labels running over it. Viability of implementing a research, education, or broader impact integration plan in the context of creating new courses or classes? Is the role of or purpose of the department? Is this the role or purpose of department letters? I'm reading this question to ask whether people create new classes as a means of broader impact. And that's definitely something that people do. I've done this. I've integrated my research directly into classes. I've, in collaborative proposals, merged courses with others to sort of do like a cross-pollination kind of strategy. You can definitely do that. And the purpose of the department letter, in my understanding, is definitely more than just to confirm that your plan is to make a course or suggest a course, but your department head has absolutely the chance to, for example, document here that you have done something similar or that the plan toward that is reasonable. So the department head should have access to your proposal and has the freedom to speak to how they believe this fits into the agenda of the department. And in my mind, would probably make a stronger letter than a letter that doesn't look like the department head actually looked at your proposal and your strategy.
Awesome. Can I add to that? It's also worth thinking if you're proposing to develop a new course, reviewers might wonder, well, you're a professor. Isn't developing a new course part of your job? Why do you need extra money to do that? So I would say, that's certainly a valid thing to include in your integrated research and education plan, but it may not be the only thing you do to get the science out of the lab.
Here's another question. Since it's a single PI, should a budget be assigned for a colleague as a consultant who would assist in part of the proposal, for example, explaining a different expertise such as genome sequencing or achieving convergence? So I think you can have collaborators. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And you can have 0% collaborators. They can volunteer, and a letter of collaboration could definitely be supportive of that. I think you want to be careful how critical that role is to your overall strategy, right? If people get the sense that you need this and without it, this whole strategy doesn't work out. The question is a little bit, is the NSF, I think, funding your career here or a career that will depend on another colleague? So I think you want to strike here a balance as to how critical this role is. You can also budget money for a consultant. I don't see a reason why that would not be possible, but I think you just want to kind of make that situation dependent on whether that makes sense. You can also have, of course, like a center, for example, do the sequencing for you, like a facility, and interpret the data and include that as a facility cost. So I think overall, it just kind of make sure that it fits within the premise of the career award, and you're not making your overall strategy too dependent on another PI. All right, the next one is, hi. Great talk. I appreciate it. Thank you. You mentioned that broader impacts could be complementary to the project. At the same time, we're being told that it is very important for the research education plan to be integrated. Is it reasonable to conclude that the education part of the broader impact must be integrated to the research plan, but other parts of the BI could be complementary to the research? That's a great question. And I think it's a very insightful question. I think in my experience in the career award, people really do expect there to be a bit more integration between the research as well as the broader impacts. And I think just like you said, the broader impacts can be multifaceted, right? They can be elements that directly arise from your research. And so they can be kind of a little more organic with your research, and then there can be other parts that can be complementary. But I think I personally would say it's more important that you have a strong, impactful strategy than to force something to be too integrated that then just doesn't seem organic. Again, the answer often is It just needs to kind of make sense overall and just instill the confidence in the reviewer that what you do is creative, has impact, and can actually be done with the time and the money that you're being allotted or that you allot for this effort. One question is, are there differences between career proposal and the NSF proposals in your writing style or proposal components? I've only written one career proposal, so my experience is limited to that. Well, I submitted it twice, but there's definitely differences. Some of them are kind of official differences, right? And just overall, you know, it's funny, I'm saying these things, and I specifically remember talking to Laurel about this, and my knowledge is largely based on what she had told me at the time. But overall, you know, the career proposal is supposed to set you up on a trajectory in the future, right? And so you just kind of want to take a broader perspective for the career proposal than you would for an unsolicited proposal. And that includes your broader impact, and that also includes integration of your research and sort of the educational components of your work. So I would definitely treat them differently, but not like an entirely different beast, right? And so I would definitely solicit other people's proposals. What I did, I actually decided on broadly what I wanted to do, looked at the program through which I wanted to go, and then I searched on the NSF website every career proposal that I got through that, or that was awarded through that mechanism. And then I looked for names of people that I knew, or that I knew somebody who knew them. And I solicited, in the end, over 10 proposals that had been funded through BMMB. And then I literally very strategically went through it and I wrote down, how did this person do it? How many references did they use? How many figures did they use? And I really constructed a pretty clear idea of like, what kind of stuff gets funded? What does this look like? And then, you know, some stuff I liked, some I didn't like. And so I really created a skeleton of a proposal based on what others had done, and then filled in the gaps, and then just made my strategy, both for broader impacts as well as for the intellectual merit, fit that skeleton. And that worked really well for me. I didn't get it the first round, but I got it the second round. And so after the first round, I made some adjustments, but somebody else is speaking to this, so I'm not going to steal their thunder. Another question here is, do you have to have a very strong publication record? Because we're just starting. Some of us may have lesser than 70 to 100 citations. Yes, absolutely. You're going to be fine without 1 million publications. Sorry, so that's a negative. No, you don't have to have a strong publication record. I think what you have to have is a good proposal, right? And there's some folks that have tons of papers that don't get a career proposal, and some folks that have very few paper that get a career grant. That definitely happens. And I think that reflects the fact that in the end, people evaluate your research plan. And as Laurel reminded me to remind you, you're talking about your future work, right? And so if you have a ton of publications in some field, and that doesn't necessarily support your strategy, it doesn't support your career proposal, they don't really add that much, right? I think nobody goes, counts the papers, says, oh, this person has 70 papers, their career proposal should be funded. That just doesn't happen, right? There may be a correlative nature, right? The more you've published, the more experience you likely have, but there's always exceptions. And people, I have not been in a panel where people have looked first at the biography, right, to make up their mind whether they want to fund a proposal or not. I think, again, you want to write a strong proposal. And I think if something critically depends on the existing of previous data, and you don't have that data, you want to make sure that somebody else has this data and that you can cite this data. But there will always be gaps, right? If everything was already figured out and documented in other people's work, then you wouldn't be proposing anything new. So it is totally okay for there to be some uncertainty, right? That is the nature of work that hasn't been done. So you don't have to have a paper to back up or sort of justify every element of your work, but you want to have some to sort of like fundamentally support the overall strategy. And that doesn't need to be your own work. Laurel kind of looked a little critical. Did I say something wrong?
No.
Okay.
Too many windows open.
Okay.
You know, this modern day problem.
Sure. All right, here it says, how does the NSF take into account the effect of the pandemic on application career trajectory during annual year 2020 to 22? For instance, if the applicant gets 2-year extension to his/her tenure clock, how does the NSF take that into account? Should it be explained somewhere? I'm going to let Laurel answer this.
Yeah, so this is This is a popular question in these times, even though I hear that the WHO is declaring that the pandemic is less of a threat than it used to be. So I would say it's not NSF that takes into account the effect, it's the reviewers. And it is, you know, reviewers don't know if you have an extension to your tenure clock or not unless you tell them. And if you are thinking you would like to tell them, you might also want to think about, well, what would they do with that information? Is it going to be relevant to the intellectual merit and broader impact of my proposal? Maybe, maybe not. You know, the department chair's letter certifies that you're eligible to apply for the career mechanism. So all that the reviewers need is to know that you're eligible. If you've had an extension due to COVID or any of the other million reasons why you might get a tenure clock extension, that's fine. You might want to tell the reviewers, you might not, and you shouldn't feel like you have to. You know, if you would like to offer an explanation, you certainly could do that. But, you know, it's not required, and reviewers might or might not know what to do with that information, because reviewers aren't judging the reason why you got an extension or whether you took one or not. They're judging your proposal and the science that you proposed to do. So I think that is about the best answer I can give.
I think we have the perfect time to just answer one more question in the last 3 minutes. From whom should we get letters of collaboration to support our proposal? Evaluators, K-12 school community colleges that plan to outreach with, companies who might benefit, or someone who owns research equipment? I would say all of it, right? I personally, I think, went overboard a little bit with letters of collaboration. I had maybe 5 or 6 or 7 or so. But everywhere where I felt like I had some outside expertise supporting me and I wanted to instill confidence because I didn't have many publications and maybe I hadn't collected all the data or used all the equipment or, you know, done all the techniques, I solicited a letter. I think if you provide 20 of them, nobody will read them, right? I think I would really focus it on sort of like critical elements of where do you think you actually need outside expertise and where do you think you need to support that through a letter. So if you have someone senior who supports a specific effort, say you're doing sequencing for the first time and somebody said, yeah, I'm going to help you with this, you may want to mention this if that's critical to your strategy and it may not be obvious from your background that you're able to do that. I think for outreach efforts, I like to see that, right? That if you say you work with this certain program, that this program is aware of that fact and you have communicated with them, that instills some confidence in me that you've taken this serious enough to reach out, communicate this, and presumably people don't just write this letter, right? Presumably they really believe in your strategy and they actually do agree to do the parts that you outlined in your proposal. So when you work with outside organizations, I think that's definitely a smart move.
Yep, but remember to follow the PAPG requirements. It's only allowed to be that like 2 sentences, copy and pasted. If you have extra content in there, your proposal could be returned without review. I'm going to say this last thing. Please reach out to me if you have questions. There's a lot of people on this call, so please don't all reach out, but I'm always happy to answer questions. I always take the time to answer my emails. If you have any specific questions, I really happily answer them. I'm sure you'll find my contact information both on this workshop's website as well as anywhere on the UT website. So please reach out. I'm really going to be happy to hear from you, and I'm going to do my best to answer your questions. And if it's an official NSF question, I'm going to refer you to Laurel, at least if that programmatically makes sense. Yeah, I think our time is up, unless Laurel, you have some more things. No, I was just going to say, Rachel, they didn't tell us which room we go to next. Do you know?
Well, that's because you get whisked away.